A few people have asked about the worm rig that I use, because most people, I think, generally when they're fishing for bream, put the worm directly onto the hook, whereas I actually use a hair. And in particular, if I'm fishing it with the sweet corn, the last thing I want with a big bream is the hook being clogged up with a worm and a bit of sweet corn. This is the rig ultimately that I use, and what I'm going to show you is how I actually go about tying this rig. So the first thing you need are these quick stops. They stay on the hair permanently, because the last thing you want is one of the temporary, for want of a better term, stops is the worm wriggling about, knocking it off, and you end up with no bait. Because I'm using a braided hook length, what I do is, you can see, I made the hole a little bit bigger. The next thing I'm using is this black silk 10-pound braid, and I'll strip off a length of this. I overdo too much of it. It's coated braid, but I strip it back, so it's quite fine even with the coat on, but I like it stripped back. And when you strip it back, it's probably the diameter of 3-pound line. I'll just show you. I know you can get tools to strip the braid off, but my fingernails work. One of the things I do is, once I've tied my hook lengths, this braid is absorbent, so I'll soak it in something like liquid Brazine. I don't know whether it's helping or not, but it can't not be a positive thing, because it's just enhancing some more flavour in and around the hook. And even if the tiniest little bit soaks out from the braid and can attract a better bite, happy days. I try and look at things that are going to give me an edge rather than a negative. So first thing I do is I take my quick stop like this, pull it off the, now hopefully, he says, the hole will be big enough for me to threadle it. Oh, there you go, second push through. I give myself plenty of room when I'm tying knots, and it's just a simple over knot like this. So with the quick stop on, that goes through. And what I want, because I'm going to have only a worm and a bit of sweet corn, I want it quite, my hair to be quite short. I like to fish my baits really tight to my hooks. I don't want to leave anything to chance. It's different if you're fishing for, 30-pound plus carp. You can have a longer hair, but with tension bream, I think, just for me personally, it reduces the chances. So I always wet my knot, and then I'll pull it down so it's relatively close to the actual quick stop itself. I then nip that off. Then the next thing I do after I've done that is I take a little bit of pole float silicone. Don't know whether you can see that, tiny little bit. So that goes on next, he says, if you can see, looking into the light, that's on. Then the next thing, I'll let that drop down to the hair. Then I'll take my hook, and I'm actually at the moment using a Drennan Barbel hook size 8. So talking with my mouthful of braid. I won't do that with the hook in my mouth. So then the next thing I do is I slide the hook through that silicone. So next thing I do, once that's on, I just adjust the length. So what I want to do is I want to leave enough room for a worm and a bit of sweet corn, and that for me is about the right distance. So this is, I'm going to show you something which might not be immediately obvious to a lot of people. So when I'm tying my hook, I'm using a knotless knot. I go through the eye, down, like that. I then wrap round 4 times, and this is where it's important. I go back down again through the eye. It's a bit tight. So that, and then I wet that and control the knot tightening down with my tongue a little bit. So the thing is, if you can see the angle of that line, that's pulling the hook down. If you go through the top of the eye, there's too much chance of it pulling the hook like that. And it might only be a couple of millimeters, but it could be the difference between a hooked fish and an absolute unmissable bite, which you miss. Then after I've done that, I put on one of my stopper beads, which these go in the bottom of, pushing the bottom of the feeder to reduce how much actual hook length I've got hanging from the bottom of the feeder. So you can see these, that just slides on like that. Whoops, Daisy, drop that. And then the next thing is I put a bit of silicone, which is gonna, silicone sleeve, which is gonna cover over my swivel at the top end of it. So I'll hook that round like that, push that on, that goes on, and then next thing, swivel. And the way I tie my swivels are always the same. Now at the moment, being winter and everything, I do vary my hook lengths according to how aggressive the fish are feeding, but I'm rarely ever more than 10 inches. I know some people, when they're fishing for bream, you know, they're like 2 foot, 2.5, 3 foot hook lengths. Me personally, 4 to 8 inches has been the right length, certainly for the big bream. I don't want to leave them the opportunity to move the hook around and move the bait around, and they're gone and I don't know what's going on. So I put a loop like that. That goes through the bottom of the swivel like that. I hope you can see this. Fuffing a bit here. Swivels on the loop like that. Got a reasonable length. So then the next thing is I turn that loop around and push it back through and create another loop like that. I then got that first loop that I created, that goes over the top of the swivel, and then what I do again, wet it down, pull it tight, make sure there's no, like what's happened there, the braid went over the top of the swivel. Just pull that down the side, and there we go, that's ready to go. And then what I do is nip off that last bit of braid. Codex, brilliant. Oh, don't know if you heard that. That was an indication. That was on my middle rod, which is on a pellet with a bit of worm. That then goes over the top like that. I then slide that into the middle. And there we have the perfect, in my opinion, worm bream hair rig. And I'm not sure if you can see all of this. The bit of silicone at the top helps cover the swivel up. This is connected to the main line by one of those quick release, and I slide a bit of silicone over that. So effectively the only metal you've got out there is that amount. I'm convinced that fish are not fond of the taste of metal, and if I can restrict, I even prefer to use plastic feeders as opposed to metal feeders, because if the fish are homing in on the feeder because of the ground bait and it's bashing at the feeder, if it's a metal feeder, I think, have you ever tried putting a bit of silver foil, I've said this before, in your mouth and see how you react? Times that by 1,000 plus for the fish. So I tend to cover up cover up as much metal as I can. So the bottom end of the rig, there's the that goes in the feeder. That's the actual hook. Now you can see the way that's sitting, where I said about the line, the braid going through the bottom of the eye. It's making the hook sit down. If you pull it through the top, and I know obviously it's heavier than the braid, so it's going to drop down like that, but if you put it through the top, there's too much chance of it pivoting on that and pushing the hook upwards that way rather than down. And I just think it, just for me, I learned a long time ago. I was missing a couple of bites when I was fishing Hemmingford Grey, and a friend of mine, Wayne Grimwood, said to me about this, and I look back now and I think how foolish I was to think that it wouldn't make a difference, but it most definitely most definitely did at the time, because once I started pulling the braid through the bottom of the eye, and you can see it hanging through the bottom of the eye, I rarely miss any bites. Going back to this bit of silicone that you can see, I can slide it about and then pull the hair out. For me, again, this is about covering up the taste of the metal, because the fish comes along, sucks that bait in. If it tastes the metal, there's too much chance, in my opinion, of it spitting it out. And whether it makes a difference, really, in the scheme of things, I'm not sure. But it certainly gives me more confidence, and confidence is the key. So I hope that's been clear. But that, with a worm and a bit of sweet corn, if them fish are out there and they're a little bit finicky, but they are prepared to feed to some extent, that nails them every time. I hope that's made sense, and I'll chat to you when and if I get a fish.